Today on America's Test Kitchen, Chris visits a local bakery to learn about bread baking. Then Julia shows Chris how to make rustic dinner rolls with a crusty exterior at home. Finally, Bridget uncovers the Test Kitchen secrets to light and airy multigrain bread. That's all right here on America's Test Kitchen.
You know, the holy grail of bread making is getting that great, crisp, crackly crust, just like this. And before we go do this in our kitchen, we're here at Iggy's Bakery with Pedja, who is the expert on crisp, crackling crusts. And we'll start by asking you, how do you do it?
The secret to a good crust is having the right oven, Chris. And these are stone deck ovens made in France.
Stone deck means what?
It means that what the bread lies on is made out of stone, which retains heat much better.
Wait, so how expensive are they?
They're
Come on,
about
tell us.
$70,000, $80,000.
Slightly out of the range of a
home cook, yeah. But the second secret is having steam injection in the oven. So by pressing that button, which releases water into the chamber, and then the steam enters the deck of the oven. When that happens, the steam allows the bread to expand and also, helps it create this crispy crust that you just saw.
So the big problem for me at home is when I'm dealing with a really wet dough, like these dinner rolls, and it's hard to handle. And it's also, when you overhandle it like I do, then the bread doesn't turn out very well at the end. So I'm here to figure out what you do, and my guess is it involves a very expensive piece of machinery. Am I right?
It does. We take a piece of dough, and regardless of how wet or stiff the dough is, when you're handling a bigger piece, it's not that difficult to pick it up. You put it on this red tray, and you spread it out evenly, and if the dough is softer, it's easier to spread out as well. You put some flour on top in order to avoid unnecessary sticking. You just pick up the tray, and you put it into the machine, close the door.
That's it?
Yeah.
And how much does that cost?
That's
in case I want to buy one.
It's about $20,000. I don't think you'll be buying it.
So now you have perfectly rounded.
You have perfectly rounded dinner rolls, and they're all even and beautiful.
Now we know how you do it. It cost me about $70,000 for the oven and $20,000 for the shaper. Now we're going to go into our test kitchen to figure out how to make great dinner rolls in your home. So we did a little research on dinner rolls around the world, and they have lots of great names. Baps, batches, oven bottoms, I like that.
Yeah, nice.
Manchets, that's medieval. Brotchens, Grundstück,
oh, nice.
Semmel, and Schripper.
Schlipper.
Not Schlipper, Schripper.
I'll stick with
It's
rolls.
not Schleppa either. So now we're sticking with dinner rolls, but these are going to be rustic.
Right. The kind you get when you go to a nice restaurant where they have a really nice crust, they have a hearty flavor, and that sort of artisanal crumb in the center that's chewy. So that's what we're after. When you get to an artisanal bread where texture really matters, this is where you want to weigh your ingredients. So this is 12.5 ounces of water. This is a teaspoon and a half of instant yeast, also known as rapid rise. And then 2 teaspoons of honey, a very small amount. Adds a little bit of sweetness, but more than that, it helps the yeast with the sugar. It helps the yeast really bloom pretty quickly. Stir that together. Make sure the honey is really dissolved in that water and it doesn't clump on the bottom. We're just going to whisk it together, make sure that yeast is nice and dissolved and that there's no honey lurking on the bottom. Now, bread flour makes great bread. We tried all-purpose, but if you want that artisanal sort of chewy center, you got to use bread flour. 16.5 ounces. Which is a little over 3 cups. And then a little bit of wheat flour, just an ounce, about 3 tablespoons of wheat flour gave it so a nice hearty flavor. So we're just gonna, on a low speed for about 3 minutes, just mix it until the dough starts to come together, and then we're gonna set it aside.
So part of any bread recipe is the hydration level, which means the weight of the water compared to the weight of the flour. We did a little test to see how does that really matter. This one we used 53% hydration level.
That's right.
And we got a nice high crumb. It's fairly fine textured.
Pretty common for sandwich bread or like a crescent roll.
Right.
Something with a lot of fat.
And then we just went wild and did 90% hydration, and you get almost a focaccia
That's
style.
Right.
You can see the texture here.
Nice big bubbly holes, where the other one is a very
so it's
fine
coarser,
crumb.
Bigger crumb. Our bread has
72% water, which is a good amount. Again, we wanted that hearty chew, but you didn't want to lose structure completely. All right, so the dough's coming together. We're going to let it sit on the counter for about 30 minutes, and then we're going to come back and knead it.
So this will be a fabulous time for me to go talk about the different kinds of flour and where they come from. Years ago, the first question I had about flour was, well, where does it come from? And it comes from the wheat berry, which is right here. There's an outer bran, there's an inner endosperm, and there's also the germ. The endosperm is mostly starch, the bran is mostly fiber, and the germ has protein and also has fat in it. Now, the different kinds of wheat, well, there are two kinds that are kind of important. There's hard wheat and soft wheat. Soft wheat is used for lower protein flours like cake or pastry. Hard wheat would be used for all-purpose bread flours, etc. And we grow mostly hard wheat in this country most of the time. Now, I hear a lot of talk about protein and gluten. Are they the same thing? Well, sort of. In flour, there are two kinds of protein, gliadin and glutenin. When the presence of water, they relax, they start to stretch out, they intermesh, and they form gluten. The other thing that forms gluten is physical action, like kneading. Again, that stretches the proteins. The thing about gluten that's interesting is it's much stronger than those two proteins alone. So you get a very strong sheets of gluten, and as bread starts to rise, those sheets act much like a balloon. It stretches very nicely and rises. So the more gluten, the more rise you get. Now, what about the flours you buy in the supermarket? Here is a chart of the different kinds from the lowest protein, cake flour around 6%, all-purpose 10 to 12, and you get up to bread flour 12 to 14, even whole wheat, which actually has 15%. All-purpose is designed to be all-purpose. You can make bread with it, believe it or not. You can make cakes, you can make cookies, you can make anything you want with it. If you wanted to substitute, just keep this one rule in mind. The more protein, it absorbs more water. So you'd have to adjust a recipe if you went from, let's say, pastry flour up to bread. The bread's going to absorb more water. Finally, if you used whole wheat flour, people say, can I substitute whole wheat for all-purpose? Yeah, 25 to 35%, more than about a third. Whole wheat's not great because the bread doesn't rise very well. Now, we did a little test here just to show you how it really impacts your cooking at home. We took 3 Irish soda breads. One is made with cake flour, one all-purpose, and this is made with bread flour. You can see right off the bat, the bread flour loaf rose much more. Why? More protein, more gluten, stretch better, contain the gases, give you a slightly lighter loaf. So let's go into the kitchen with Julia and see how that bread dough is coming along.
All right, so this has been sitting for 30 minutes, and you can see the dough looks quite different. It looks a little bit smoother. So now we're going to knead the dough, and now's the good time to add the salt. This is 1½ teaspoons of salt. We're going to just knead this dough on a fairly low speed, about 2 on a KitchenAid, for about 5 minutes or so. All right, so the dough's really come together. You can see it looks much smoother. Now what we're going to do is we're going to put it on more of a medium speed, and we're going to look for the dough to come together into more of a cohesive bowl, but also we're going to see how wet the dough is. So we're looking for how does the dough stick to the sides of the bowl. You want it to stick anywhere from that much in the bottom, up to about that much in the bottom. If it starts to really climb up the sides of the bowl on medium speed, that's when you add just a little flour to accommodate for the moisture. Here we go. So you can tell already this dough is not sticking to the side of the bowl at all, which is perfect. All right, so that's been about a minute. You can see the dough really has collected into more of a cohesive ball, which is just what we want. If you could grease that bowl, and when you have to pull the dough out of a sticky bowl, you lose a lot of the air bubbles that you're trying so hard to get. Can you also spray just this little bit? Nice, just a little right there. All right, so we're gonna turn this dough right into this greased bowl.
So the total kneading time was what for this?
It was
very
about
short.
6 minutes.
Right.
It took about 3 minutes to pull the dough together, and then we let it rest. Then we knead it for about 6 minutes.
So does that resting period where the dough's hydrating, does that mean you don't have to knead it as much? It's sort of working like kneading, right?
Exactly. Okay. It's a very gentle form of kneading. It lets that flour hydrate, so the kneading is much more effective when you get to it.
Okay.
So we're going to let this sit for about an hour until, again, it's about half again as big, or doubled by about 50%.
So we'll be back when something here doubles in size. I think it's the dough.
Or my head. All right, so it's been about an hour, and this has grown quite a bit. You can see it's about 50% larger. And now I'm going to show you turning, which is something we've recently latched onto in the kitchen. And what it is in the middle of bread rising, you slowly fold it over, and it does two things. It gives the yeast fresh food, so you get even bigger, heartier air bubbles. And it also helps with the kneading a little bit. And believe it or not, this makes a substantial difference in the flavor and the texture of the bread. So we're going to do this twice. You're going to fold it, let it sit for 30 minutes. We're going to fold it again, let it sit for another 30 minutes. All right, so the dough is ready to be shaped. I'm going to do a little recap of where we've been. We kneaded the dough, let it rise for an hour. Then we folded it, doing that little technique, let it sit for 30 minutes, folded it again, let it sit for 30 minutes, so it doubled in size, and now we're ready to shape.
I'm ready.
All right, so what I'm gonna do, it's a wet, sticky dough. I'm gonna use a good amount of flour all over this board for our shaping. And I'm gonna pull the dough out. You can see how it's a sticky dough, but it releases really nicely from the bowl. You don't lose any because
it was well spread.
That's right. A little flour over the top, and we're gonna cut the dough pretty much in half using this bench scraper. And I'm being ginger with the dough on purpose because we've built all this nice air structure and we don't want to lose too much of it. So I'm gonna take each half, I'm gonna gently stretch it till it's about 16 inches long. That ruler's only 15 inches, so we're gonna tack another inch on. And again, I'm handling it on the ginger side because I really don't want to lose too many of those air bubbles. That's pretty good. And I'm going to do the same with this guy. All right, so now all I'm going to do is cut each of these into 8 pieces. And to do that, I'm going to cut it in half and then quarters and then cut each quarter in half. That way it's easier to get evenly sized rolls. Now, because this dough is so wet, when we shape it, you lose the air bubbles, but also we found it really fell flat in the oven. So what we're gonna do, spray some cake pans, and with floury hands, I'm gonna pick up each piece of dough, toss it back and forth a little bit, and put them into the cake pans. And again, the cake pans will provide a little bit of support during the baking. We're actually only gonna bake them in the cake pans for about 10 minutes and then pull them apart and bake them individually, you know, on sheet pans because all the edges kind of bake together and you don't get that gorgeous crust.
So one more time. So you can't do this from the beginning on a baking sheet, like a half baking sheet.
Yep.
Because there won't be enough structure. They'll
fall flat. Cover them with plastic wrap. You don't want them to dry out as they rise. And that happens with dough. You can see that the top really starts to dry out and then it prevents the dough from rising because it's created sort of a crust. All right, so it's been about 30 minutes that these shaped rolls have been rising. So before we put these guys in the oven, I'm gonna spray them a little bit with water. And this will do a couple things. It'll keep the dough moist during the first few minutes of baking so they can really rise. The other thing it'll do is it imitates that steam-injected ovens that the professional bakeries have, and that's how you get that gorgeous artisanal hearty crust. All right, so that is a very hot oven, 500 degrees. We're gonna bake them for about 10 minutes, and then we're gonna turn the oven temperature down. That's how you get that hallmark crust.
So it's a good time to talk about something called oven spring. The clock's ticking now.
Yep.
Because at some point that outer crust is going to set.
That's right.
You don't want it to set before it's finished rising. So a really hot oven to start, the yeast kicks off a little more carbon dioxide, and the moisture in the bread also turns to steam. So both of those things will inflate the dough.
Right.
So you want to do that as quickly as possible. I actually seen recipes in the 19th century where they always said start in a hot oven and then turn it down after about 20 minutes. So they knew all about oven spring too.
Absolutely.
So ain't nothing new.
All right, so these guys have been baking at 500 degrees for about 10 minutes. And what we're gonna do is turn the oven temperature down to 400. And I'm gonna then take these rolls out of the oven and remove them from their pans so that they can get crisp on the sides. We're just gonna dump them right onto the baking sheet. And then you can let them cool for a little bit if they're quite hot. Or if you have asbestos hands like I do, you can just go in there and pull them apart. Flip them right side up. So you want to spread these out, and they go back into a 400-degree oven, 10 to 15 minutes longer till they're golden all over. And of course, halfway through that baking time of 10 to 15 minutes, I'm going to spin the pan around so that they brown evenly. May I offer you a roll?
Absolutely.
So what happened is they finished baking, and again at 400 degrees, 10, 15 minutes. Took them out, took the rolls off the hot pan, let them cool for about an hour on a wire rack.
Can I eat?
Yeah. I gave you the roll right off the bat because I knew.
Smart.
I knew. You can hear, aren't they good and crisp all the way around?
So great rustic dinner rolls start with a fairly high hydration level, 72%, a little bit of whole wheat flour, but the real trick was starting in a 500-degree oven in 2 cake pans. So we got a nice spring in the oven, taking them out, putting them on a baking sheet, lowering the oven to 400, and then they brown nicely all around the side. So there you have it, from America's test kitchen to your kitchen, a fabulous recipe for homemade rustic dinner rolls. Better than a restaurant, don't you think?
These are awesome.
Yeah, these are really good. Laudate Dominum omne In our small town in Vermont, we actually have a monastery at the top of the mountain, and our Carthusian monks have it rough. Heavy brown robes in the summer, cold bedrooms in the winter. They're a silent order, and their bread, it's so bad, it's just like doing penance. So let's go into the test kitchen with Bridget and make a multi-grain bread that tastes so good, it ought to be a sin. Well, multi-grain bread, I'm just getting things started the right way. This weighs
a ton.
So we got barley, whole wheat, organic oat flour, pumpernickel, durum. Yep.
Okay.
And medium rye. I finally brought Bridget flowers.
I'll put them in some water later, Chris. Thank you. Well, you see two problems with multigrain bread. The heft, multigrain bread is as dense as a doorstop. And the other problem is you have to go from store to store and find all the different grains that you want in there.
So is the thought that counts?
It's a thought that counts,
okay, but no.
Get it out of here. That's right. So what I have here is a little bit of your breakfast.
Mapo.
Mapo, that's right. This sludge, this hot grain cereal mix, is one of the key steps to our bread. I've got a couple of examples here. Now these have a variety of different grains inside of them, and we found it was great. It's a one-stop shopping. What I did was I took 1 1/4 cups of that hot cereal mix and topped it off with 2 1/2 cups of boiling water. Stirred it a couple times, let it cool down for about an hour until it reached 100 degrees. So to this porridge, we're gonna add a few ingredients. I've got 1/4 cup of honey, which is a natural pairing with multigrain bread, and 1/4 cup of melted butter. We've let it cool just slightly. And butter, not only adds great flavor, but it also adds a little bit of tenderness. We want a sandwich loaf that's nice and tender.
And some ground tree bark just to end up...
No tree bark in here. All right, and 2 1/2 teaspoons of instant or rapid rise yeast. Just stir this quickly together. But we're not done yet. Whole wheat flour gives bread kind of a bad reputation. It's very dense, it's very squat. When you activate flour, either all-purpose, whole wheat, any kind of flour with water, what happens is it produces gluten, which is the structure inside the bread that allows it to lift. Well, whole wheat flour has these little sharp bran flakes inside of it that kind of cut the gluten off at the knees, so to speak, and prevent it from rising, prevent it from getting enough structure.
I don't think anyone in bread making has ever used that image before, cutting it off at the knees. Yeah, you're in a violent mood today, I can tell.
Well, they act like little shards, and they kind of slice away at the gluten, so it never has a good chance to rise, and that's why you get those squat little loaves. So we're going to dilute the whole wheat flour with some all-purpose flour, which some people do, but we're actually going to use a 2-to-1 ratio of all-purpose flour to whole wheat flour. So I've got 7 1/2 ounces whole wheat and 15 ounces or 3 cups of all-purpose flour. I'll just whisk these together just to mix them evenly. And we can start mixing. So on to low speed. Just add it a 1/2 cup at a time. All right, now I have the last little bit right in there. That's about a 1/2 cup left in there. Probably about a minute. Okay, so that's all the kneading I'm going to do at this particular point. We're going to just cover this bowl with a little bit of plastic wrap and let this sit for about 20 minutes. And this is called autolyse. And this is when the flour is allowed to sit there and fully hydrate. And what happens is it activates the gluten on its own without any kneading. It makes the dough a lot more supple, a lot more workable, and it'll be a much more tender dough at the end of it.
So you're lazy too. You're just going to walk away for 20 minutes.
I've got to go cut something off at the knees.
So we'll be right back.
All right, it's been 20 minutes. The autolyse has completed its cycle. So now I'm going to add a tablespoon of table salt, and we're going to continue to knead this at medium-low speed for about 3 to 4 minutes, just until the dough really starts to pull away from the sides of the bowl. Now, if it doesn't, I would add 1 to 2 tablespoons of flour in there and continue mixing. All right, so you can see the dough is pulling away from the sides, but now we're going to continue letting this knead for about 5 more minutes in order to build that structure of the bread. Okay, the dough has come together into a tight little ball. So now we're going to take this opportunity to add some seeds. This is 3/4 cup of pumpkin seeds. You could also add sunflower seeds. We're just going to mix this in for about 15 seconds. That should do it. I'm just going to start kneading it by hand to get those seeds evenly dispersed. So Chris, while I'm doing this, if you could spray that bowl over there with a little bit of vegetable oil spray. So I'm working this into a tight little ball here, and put this in the well-greased bowl. Kind of run it around there so that all sides are well-greased, and if you could take a piece of plastic and put that right on there. All right, so we're going to let this sit here at room temperature, and we want to let this double in size. That's a heavier dough. It's going to take a little longer than we would ask for in some plain old white flour doughs. All right, Chris, it's been about an hour. You can see it's doubled nicely. So now it's time to shape the loaves. All right, just going to turn this out onto the board. Looks lovely.
It does look lovely, I'd say.
Just going to pat this out to about a 12 by 9 inch rectangle. Put my ruler there so I can see what's going on. Excellent. Now I'm going to cut this in half. Again, this is for 2 loaves. Just set one of these aside for a second. Now to shape this into a loaf, starting with one of the short ends, I'm just gonna start rolling it in on itself, keeping it kind of nice and tight as I go. And then see this seam edge, I wanna make sure that I pinch it shut very well. We don't want this opening up on itself. We're gonna roll this in a little bit of oatmeal. I've got a half a cup of oatmeal. So to get the oatmeal to stick, just wanna spray the bread with a little bit of vegetable oil spray. And just take the oats, spread them out there, start working it around. Make sure it's nicely covered with the oats.
So this is like one of those flags that's saying this is healthy bread, just so in case you couldn't get the concept.
I'm trying to convince myself. All right, so I want to put the seam side down in this 9 by 5 inch loaf pan that we've already greased. So we need to let these rise again. Again, we want them to almost double in size, so I'm going to cover them with plastic. All right, so it's been about 35 minutes, and you can tell that these are done. They're beautiful.
Where's that knuckle thing you promised me?
I will prove it with the knuckle technique. All right, so I'm going to take my knuckle, push it in there, see how it springs back? So we know that that's proof, because if it wasn't risen enough, it would just stay indented.
Okay.
Okay? We're gonna bake them at a 375 degrees, but the oven rack is at middle position until the internal temperature reaches 200 degrees, and that's gonna be between 35 to 40 minutes. So I'll probably go in about 20 minutes and reverse those loaf pans, make sure that they're baking evenly. Oh, look at these. They smell great. There we go. All right, so to prove that we baked these to 200, I'm gonna check it right from the side. That way I don't make any marks on top. Look at that.
I have to say they are spectacular looking.
We are gonna turn them out immediately onto the rack. All right, Chris, all the hard work is over, but now comes the painful part, the waiting for the bread to cool down. And we need to let this cool down for 3 full hours before we cut into it.
That sounds a particularly long time.
All the best things are worth waiting for. I'm impressed. It's been 3 hours and not one nibble is out of this loaf.
You haven't turned it over. I just hollowed it out from the underneath.
All right, so it's cooled off and we are ready to eat this. I'm gonna have you slice. It doesn't feel all dense. That knife isn't working too hard.
I must admit, it looked like it was gonna be a heavy loaf.
It is light. It's not cottony and fluffy. It's not fake feeling.
This is terrific.
It's better than anything you can get out of the supermarket.
It's light, it has a little bit of chew to it, has great flavor. The crust is really nice, and it's got the oats on the top, so you know, of course, it's healthy. So the secret to great multigrain bread actually wasn't multigrain, it was a hot cereal mix. Arrowhead Mills or Bob's Red Mill let it sit with some water for about an hour. Then we used 2 parts white, 1 part whole wheat, and the Autolyse system, which allowed that water to hydrate, and that created some gluten and some structure. So there you have it, from America's Test Kitchen, your kitchen, a fabulous recipe for delicious homemade multigrain bread that you're really gonna wanna eat.
Yeah. It makes great toast too.